If you have your Bibles, be turning to 1 Corinthians 13. 1 Corinthians 13. As we continue our study on this Paul's digression. It is not a complete separation, obviously, from the discussion at hand, but chapters 12 through 14 is dealing with spiritual gifts and the regulation of spiritual gifts. With I think a pointed focus on the miraculous, though we saw at the end of chapter 12 that it's not just miraculous, and then we'll see also at the end of in chapter 14, about mid-chapter 14, another reference to other gifts as well. But he ends chapter 12 with, to earnestly desire the spiritual gifts, right, the charismata, and he said, but I will show you a more excellent way. There's a better way than all of these. And of course, that begins his digression. He's leading into something else. And chapter 13 then becomes the answer to all the problems at Corinth. And the answer is love. Love is the more excellent way. It is the higher way. It is the way or the road that is going to lead to their salvation, ultimately, because they're divided. I think maybe, yeah. If I turn that on, it works better. All right. Oh, yeah, now that sounds a little better to me. So we went through the 15 actions of love, culminating with that the staccato punch at the end of the list there in verse 7. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And so he says, love never ends, or love never fails, love never runs out. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. And he gives us three of those very things that he'd been talking about in the miraculous sense in chapter 12, verses 8 through 10. That is prophecy, tongues, and knowledge. And he says these things are in part. They're only partial. It's not the maturity. It's not the end result. It's not ultimately what God is desiring. And I believe it's in Wayne Jackson's notes at the end of the Star Publishers ASV New Testament. Some of you may have that, some may not. But if you'll, in the back, there's several charts that Brother Jackson has in there. And one of them is talking about miraculous gifts. And he talks about how they're like the scaffolding around the building. And so there's this picture of a building with scaffolding around it. And once the building is finished, what do? You take the scaffolding away. You don't leave the scaffolding up. You take it away. And so the scaffolding in the building of the church were these miraculous gifts. And once the complete comes, or once the mature comes, then that which is in part is going to be done away. And that's what he says. These things are going to cease. They're going to pass away because the perfect has come. And we talked about the perfect last week being, some say, well, that's when, it's talking about the return of Jesus because Jesus is truly the only perfect one. And so he must be talking about Jesus. And yet we look at perfect and we often think of it in the idea of without blemish. Jesus is without blemish. But remember, this word can also mean or carry the idea of maturity or completion. And so when that which is in part comes to completion, and the things that we see, there's going to pass away. Whenever that which is perfect comes, when it's completed, these partial things, particularly prophecy, knowledge, and tongues, in verse 8. They're going to stop. And so the question is what is that perfect? And I think we looked at several different options. The idea of it being Jesus, or the idea of it being something that is currently in pieces, we might say, and yet will be ultimately finished. I believe that this is talking about the coming of the New Testament, the completion of the New Testament. And so Paul is writing 1 Corinthians around 53, 54. And so, there's the last writings will be done around 96, if we take a late date on the book of Revelation. So you have about 42 years or so of writing left to be done, of inspiration, revelation left to be done. Some of it has already been done, obviously. Many believe that at least 1 Thessalonians was written before or prior to 1 Corinthians, 1 Thessalonians, maybe even 2 Thessalonians as well. Galatians possibly was written at this time. James was probably written by now. But then the rest of the New Testament really is awaiting being written. So the vast majority of the book of the New Testament is still yet to be completed when Paul is writing this. And so that makes more sense, because when it comes to miracles, the thing we need to understand about miracles is they were readily displayed oftentimes to prove itself, or ultimately it was always to prove the message that someone was teaching, but it was to instill faith and awe in people. And people who claim miracles today, we don't see that, do we? We don't see. We still have graveyards. We still have hospitals, right? Those who had the ability to raise the dead and heal the sick, seems like we wouldn't have as many graveyards and as many hospitals as we have today. In a debate years ago, one brother with a Pentecostal man said, really this is not a debate about argumentation, it's a debate about demonstration. At which point he pulled out a 3-liter Coke bottle with a rattlesnake in it and sat it on the other guy's table and asked him to take it out and hold it. Believe it or not, he didn't take the snake out of the bottle. But you think of Paul in Acts chapter 27, whenever he is bitten by the viper, and everyone thinks, he's about to die because this must be a wicked, wicked man because this snake has bitten him. And, when he pulled his hand out, remember, the snake is hanging from his hand. And he casts the snake away, and nothing happens to Paul. Why? Because they were able to take up snakes even. Of course, that gave rise to what we see today as modern-day, snake handlers. I haven't really heard of anyone in Colorado being big-time snake handlers. I heard it more in Texas, Louisiana, stuff like that. Are there any snake handling churches around here that you know of? There were some in Kentucky. Yeah, Kentucky, Louisiana. It seems like some of those mid-south states have those. I remember there was the big report about Punkin Brown. He was a snake handler. He died from a snake bite. And he was the preacher, and he died in the service. They were having a snake handling service, a snake bit him, and he died. If it's a miracle to prove that this is all true, then he shouldn't have died. Along with snake handlers, there are some who are poison drinkers. There are churches where part of the service is drinking strychnine. Mind you, it's a very watered-down form of strychnine, and you start off with just a little bit, and then the next time you take just a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more, so that you build up a tolerance to the poison. But if it were really a miracle, what would you do? You wouldn't have to dilute it, and you gulp it down like you were coming in from 3 days into the desert. That's the miracle. The miracles, remember, were always something that were a powerful demonstration. It was a outward sign. Most people that go to faith healing services nowadays, they're healed of cancer and diabetes and these internal medicine or diseases that you don't see. And someone says, yes, but look at them, they're stronger. After they've been touched by Benny Hinn or blown on or whatever it is he's doing in that particular service, they're stronger. Well, we understand that our body reacts to endorphins, right? When when we're in the height of euphoria or excitement or things like that, there are great feats of strength of people who are afraid, endurance of people who are running or panicking. There are moments that we see that we read about that are almost superhuman, and yet what we understand those to be is in those moments that the adrenaline is flowing and pumping, and we do more than what we ever thought we could. Okay, that happens. Is that something that's happening in the euphoria of a faith healing session? Very well could be. Are some of them plants? Reporting has shown that some of those who are healed in faith healing sessions were never sick in the first place. They were planted by the faith healer to come up and mimic a certain disease or whatever, and then be made whole. Miracles, God is not helped by those moments, and it truly is a matter of demonstration. And so when we come here, we see that this which is incomplete, is going to become complete. I believe is the New Testament. Once the New Testament is finished, then those things which are partial, the scaffolding, is going to be taken away. And so Paul says in verse 11, when I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. But when I became a man, and see, here's that idea of maturity. It's not without blemish, it's the idea of maturity. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. Well, the childish here is representative of the tongues, the prophecy, and the knowledge in verse 8. Those miraculous gifts. And so when that which is perfect is come, when I become a full-grown man, I gave up childish things. We cannot expect the scaffolding to stay. The miracles were for a specific purpose. When Jesus was here, they were to prove that he was the Son of God. He was who he said he was. Whenever he left the Spirit with the apostles in John chapter 14 through 16, the Spirit was going to bring to their remembrance. He was going to guide them into all truth. And ultimately, the Spirit was also going to give them the ability to perform signs and wonders. And that sign, that's the John's word for miracle is sign. Matthew, Mark, and Luke use the word dunamis, but John uses sign, but both mean the same thing. These are they point to something greater. Yes, dunamis is the power, but sign is a sign of a greater power, and I think that's why John chose sign, writing later than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He wants it because it points to something else. The study of semiotics today, by the way, we get semiotics from semia, which is the word sign in the Greek. Semiotics is the study of signs, things like words. The word dog. Those symbols. Dog. We call them letters. But it spells a word. The word is dog. But dog is simply a word if there's nothing behind it. If there's, if there's no meaning to it for the sign to point to, then the word is worthless. A bippable amotment. I remember taking a writing course, and that was a phrase that we was in some of our writing examples. A bimpable amotment. You know what that means? It doesn't mean anything. It's words. It's a word that has no sign behind it. There's no sign behind it. Right? That's like, someone speaking a word to you that you don't know. There's no sign. There's nothing behind it. That's the study of semiotics. And so when John comes along and he says these this was the first sign that Jesus did in Cana of Galilee to manifest his glory, John 2:11. We take what he's saying is this sign, this miracle pointed to something behind it that was even greater. Okay? And so that's what the signs did for Jesus. Those signs were going to follow the apostles. That's what it did for them. Paul is saying in the beginning of the church, these signs, these miracles, were not the end goal. You know, the miracles' end goal wasn't to heal people. The miracles' end goal wasn't to give sight to the blind or hearing to the deaf. The miracles' goal, the end result, what God designed it for, was faith in people, that they would see, what these people are saying is true. Because they didn't have a New Testament to turn to. Let's turn to 1 Corinthians. It was being written, but it wasn't completed yet. Once it's completed, they didn't need the signs for that end result of proving that this teacher was speaking the truth. They had the word to back it up. And so when that which was complete, the word, came, then that which was in part, the tongues, the prophecies, the miracles, they were done away with. They weren't needed anymore. Here's a great word, the law of parsimony. You ever heard that before? Some say parsimony. Parsimony. It means that God will do things the easiest way possible. God is not going to Rube Goldberg the world. You know, everything is as simple as possible from point A to point B. And the law of parsimony is that miracles had a purpose, and once that purpose was completed, then we don't need those things anymore. You don't need all the extra things because, again, it wasn't about healing and the sick or raising the dead or speaking in tongues. It was all about proving that the person who is speaking spoke the truth. And when we have the word to prove that, we don't need that which is in part. So he says, now we see, right now, RT, the word now is RT, right now we see in a mirror dimly. The word dimly here is translated from the word enigma, puzzle. Now we see in a mirror, puzzlingly, we might say. Darkly, the King James says. Dimly here, the ESV. And the idea is that, you know, sometimes we look in the mirror, you know, it's maybe not as clean as it could be. The light is not as bright as it could be. They did not have the same mirror technology that we had. They would simply polish metal. And their metals oftentimes were brass or bronze, and so there would be a color distortion in the mirror. If they weren't perfectly flat, there would be, you know, warps in the face of the mirror, and it could warp the image that was coming back at you. And so he says, right now we are looking in a mirror, or we see in a mirror dimly. And what's interesting here is what Paul does not say. He does not say what we see. There's no direct object for the word see. Normally we'd say something like, you know, I see Hugo. Hugo is my direct object. I'm telling you what I'm seeing. Paul doesn't tell us what we're seeing. He just says we see through a glass or in a glass or in a mirror. Dimly, it's telling how we see through or in the mirror and dimly. It doesn't tell us what we're seeing. Now we might quickly say, yes, but it's a mirror, so we would expect to see in the mirror what? Our reflection, right, ourselves. Go ahead, Terry.
But my Bible says, now we see but a poor reflection as in a mirror.
Okay.
So, never, blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall see God.
Yes, but that word poor and the word that they're translating poor are completely different ideas. They're not even the same word. The word that is translated poor there is the word enigma. That word is not used for the poor when he says blessed are the poor in spirit. So completely different ideas there. but I understand what your translation is saying. It's saying that it's not just that we're looking in a mirror, but we're looking in a mirror and what we're seeing is distorted, or it's poor. It's a poor image quality. And because that is here, that enigma that is used here for dimly, that is telling how we're seeing. We're not just seeing through a mirror or in a mirror. We're seeing it, and it's not a good reflection. So I think we're right in that even though he doesn't say, we see ourselves in a mirror dimly, we understand when you're looking in a mirror, the reflection is us. That's the implication. Why is that important? Because in the next phrase, but then face to face. Okay, so he uses these two adverbs of time, now, arti, and tate, then. He uses them to say now and then. He's separating these times, and of course he means now before that which is perfect has come, then after that which is perfect has come. That's the then, now and then that he's specifically speaking of. So then, and the verb we see applies to the now, and it also applies to the then. And so all we have after the then is the prepositional phrase face to face, which modifies how we see. So in the now we see, and understand we're talking about Paul's now, not our 2021 now. In Paul's now we see dimly in a mirror, then we will see face to face. But here again, there's no direct object in this phrase or this clause either. And so commentators are confused as to say, well, what will we see face to face? Now, those who believe that the perfect coming is Jesus, and that we today are still in the age of miracles, believe the face-to-face is seeing Jesus face-to-face, or God face-to-face. But I don't think that fits the context well. With no direct object, the implied object in the mirror is ourselves. James chapter 1, 22 through 25, he who beholds his natural face in a mirror and then turns around and forgets what he looks like. It's the same word here. The implied object is ourselves. And so we're seeing ourselves face to face, most clearly, we might say. I think it's like the mirror is taken out of the way, and what we see, and I'll get to you in just a second, Paul, what we see in the perfect then is a reflection of who we truly are. I think that's what Paul is talking about. When that which is perfect has come, it tells us more about ourselves than we've ever known. And we see ourselves for who we are more clearly than we've ever seen before. Even the clearest mirror cannot expose us the way the Bible does. All right, Paul?
I was just thinking a little different than that, but it might be more accurate. I was kind of thinking it goes back to the perfect and the partial, whereas the partial you only see part of it. You
Okay.
don't have a clear picture, just like the mirror. But when you're face to face, it's just a clear image, just like the perfect will be
Certainly, yeah.
complete and clear to you. You can't miss it.
Absolutely. And I think you're right. It's definitely this contrast between the dim and the clear. Then he goes further and he says, now I know in part, then I shall know fully. I don't think the word know here in verse 12 is that miraculous knowledge that he'd been talking about necessarily. I think this is more just, right now, I only know part of the story. But then, when it's completed, when the perfect has come, I will know more fully. I will know the story fully. So the word, of course, gnosko, where we get like agnostic and things like that, means to know. So he says, right now I maru, which is in part, gnosko. I know in part. I only know part of the story. Then, and he uses not just know, but he uses a heightened form. He compounds it with the word epigenosko. Then I will fully know. And so it's same root word, but it's modified with this by making it a compound word. Then I will fully know. I will know completely. And it's future tense. I will know. But then he says, the last phrase, that last clause here, even as I have been fully known. And that's the same epigenosko, but now it's in a passive form, meaning that it's not something I know, but that I am known. And he uses that same fully known. I am fully known. Well, who fully knows Paul? God. God fully knows. He says, I'm going to know myself. I'm going to know the way. I'm going to know the story more fully. Just as I am already fully known by God. And I think that goes back to that seeing ourselves dimly. We only see, even in the mirror, we only see, part of ourselves, right? When I get my hair cut, when she finishes, she always gives me a mirror and turns my back to the full mirror so I can look at the back of myself in the mirror. Because if you're just looking at your face in the mirror, what do you not see? The back of your head. So on Sunday afternoon, after you've taken a nap in the recliner and your hair's all messed up back here, and you go and you look in the mirror and you think, I look fine. And then your wife says, no, you need to comb the back of your hair. Well, see, I looked fine in the mirror because I didn't have a mirror to look at the back of my head. Mirrors don't show the whole picture. But God knows the whole picture. He knows everything. And he's always known it. And that's the impact of he says, I will fully know as I am already fully known by God. Ivan?
We know that letters were circulated to other churches.
Yes.
But is there anywhere in history that indicates how widely spread they were? I mean, like the churches of Asia were pretty close, but you get over in Greece and there's a long. So I mean, is there any?
That is a great question, and the short story of how we know what when it was. Paul dies around 64, 65. We know that because he dies during the time of Nero. Nero dies in 68, and so it had to be before then. It appears that Paul, he obviously dies in prison. There is a question about whether there was one imprisonment or two imprisonments. I personally believe there were two separate ones, that he did get out for a short time, that he did make some other missionary work. Tradition says he went all the way to Rome. I don't believe he made it to Rome, but I can't prove he didn't, even because that was his goal ultimately. He's back in prison though, and I think you can trace the things that he says basically to Timothy is where we would trace, what happened to him there. So he dies after he writes 2 Timothy. It's the last book that he writes. It's in prison. It's probably around 64. One of the things that he tells Timothy in that letter, chapter 4 and verse 13, is that right? When he tells him First Timothy 5, maybe verse 26, no, it's back in 2 Timothy. He says, bring the parchments and bring the books. I'm pretty sure that's 2 Timothy 4, verse 13. Bring the parchments, bring the books, bring the cloak that I left with Trophimus. And so the books, and I believe this is probably true. I believe the books and the parchments, these were the things that not just his writing utensils, but the books he had already written. So I think Paul was keeping copies of all of his letters that he would send. He had a copy to the book of, not the book of Romans. He had a copy of the letter to Rome, a copy to both, to the letters to Corinth. He had these copies, and he had left them. And he's telling Timothy, when you come, bring those books with you. Bring my copies of the letters. Okay, so. Peter, who in who mentions being in Babylon. She who is in Babylon also greets you. And most believe that to be a reference to the church in Rome, meaning that Peter was probably in Rome, in prison, in 64, 65, 66, which would put him in prison with who? Paul. And in 2 Peter, Peter mentions the scriptures and the writings of Paul. Now, Peter also is killed by Nero, according to tradition, around 66, maybe 67. But if Paul's writings are already considered scripture by Peter in 66, that suggests that Paul's writings in that 2-year span are starting to become known already. And if Peter happened to be in Rome with Paul when Timothy showed up with the books, he got to see Paul's writings. Clement of Rome, who writes, remember, he writes a letter. The church at Rome and the elders there write a letter to the elders at Corinth and say, look, you remember what Paul wrote you? You're not doing right. You need to get back on track again. It's an uninspired letter, but it's written about the same time the book of Revelation is written. And he makes reference to Paul's writings. So around 90, 91, which is about 40 years later, Clement of Rome already recognizes the scriptures of Paul as inspired scripture. Now, how did he know? Well, the debate is, in just 40 years, there wouldn't have been the collection of Paul's letters wouldn't have come together. Well, I don't think someone had to go around to Corinth and copy down 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians and then travel over here to Philippi and write down Philippians, and then travel over here and get a copy of to the church at Colossae. I don't think that someone had to do that. I think Paul had already done that. And he had them with him in prison with Peter, who, by the way, was also with Clement of Rome. He's imprisoned at Rome. The church at Rome is ministering to him. The leaders would have been intimately involved with Peter or with Paul at that time. And certainly Clement would have been familiar with the letters that Paul wrote. So Paul's writing likely, in my mind, by 66 had already been collected by Paul, and shortly thereafter would have been published and going throughout the world. So that by the time you get to Clement, for example, in 90, 92, writing First Clement, he expects Corinth to be familiar with, not just with the letters of that they received, but other letters of Paul as well. Clement writes to some of the other, Polycarp is another one. Polycarp, who's an elder in the church at Smyrna, he writes to Philippi and a few other places and makes reference to Paul's letters, and Polycarp's writing 95, maybe 100. So within 40 years, I would say people knew these letters.
And I think the travel was a lot more than we think of it today. I mean,
There was a lot of movement.
a lot more than
That's in the fullness of time. I think the fullness of time wasn't just about, hey, the world was just so bad it was time to send Jesus. It's that everything in the world was perfect for this moment. And I think the language, the far reach of the Greek language was part of that fullness of time. I think another thing that was part of the fullness of time was the Roman highway system. I mean, look, I walked the Roman highway road, the Via de Mare, which is, the way by the sea, literally, through Caesarea Maritima. And you can see wagon tracks in solid stone because people have been riding and walking down this road for literally thousands of years to get from one place to the next place. And so the highway system certainly allowed travel. Sailing was considered very safe, although we do have the shipwreck of Paul. But it's because they knew whenever you reach this time of the year, you don't go. You don't sail anymore. The captain is trying to get a little more cash by getting there in time. Paul says it's not a good time to go. It's time for ships to harbor. No, we can make it. And a bad decision by a captain leads to the shipwreck. But normally, sailing was very safe in the Mediterranean world. I mean, this is just everything about that fullness of time. And so, yeah, travel was, obviously not like us traveling. It would still take weeks to get from one place to another. But I want to say that in the first century world, using the highway system, they would average somewhere between 12 and 20 miles a day. That would depend on how many elevations and things like that, how many turns, and what kind of. But 12 to 20 miles in a day walking. Paul, it's estimated that Paul went almost 1,500 miles in his missionary journeys. That's a lot of miles. But yeah, travel was there. Paul was a traveling preacher. He was used to traveling. And so, just based upon the cities that he went to and went back from and so forth, about 1,500 miles. And that's a lot of travel. And Paul, I'm sure when he was in Galatia, in those cities, was telling them about other churches that he'd established. By the time he gets to his third missionary journey, it's normal for Christians, especially preachers, as they get with other people, to tell stories, tell what's happened here. You'll never believe what happened to me at Lystra. You'll never believe what happened when I was over here. And so you can imagine Paul telling these stories of other churches that he helped establish to these churches he's now establishing. So yeah, travel and the spread of that word. Now, I will tell you, the scenario I have given of Paul having copies of his letter, that's a minority view in scholarship in biblical scholarship, critical scholarship, I should say. It's a very minority view. Most believe that Paul's letters would not have come together until around 115, early 2nd century, and that pseudo Peter, false Peter, wrote 2nd Peter and made reference to the scriptures of Paul because and the reason why they believe that is because there's no way Paul's scriptures or Paul's writings would have been counted as scripture before early 2nd century, and so 2nd Peter would have had to been written later. Peter's already dead, and so they don't even consider 2nd Peter written by Peter. But I don't think you have to go that far. I think you just show that it was very common in the 1st century for people who were letter writers to keep copies of their letters. Cicero did it. Seneca was famous for it. People who predate the 1st century were famous for it. So the idea that Paul would keep copies of his letter, that's not far-fetched at all. People he learned from and was familiar with did it. And so why shouldn't he have done it? That goes, I know we're way off topic now. We'll get verse 13 and we'll start in chapter 14 next week, I guess. But
I'm sorry for
no. I think that we have ample evidence to be confident in the scriptures that we have.
And the point I sort of getting at, that there's going to be a lot of congregations know this same thing pretty soon.
Yes.
I mean, it's not going to be on the internet, but I mean, it's going to be getting out pretty soon. And I would imagine if Paul came and he had a copy, and he goes to another city, somebody'd say, well, hey, I'd like a copy of that. And they
Yes.
get their scribe and make a copy while he's there.
It's estimated that Paul spent roughly, like writing the book of Romans, the amount of paper, parchment, and everything that it would take, and put in today's dollar, it cost him around $1,200 to write Romans. But that's a pretty good chunk of money. Which tent makers must have done well. But what if I wanted a copy and I wasn't a tent maker? See, it was very difficult to get copies. And most of the copies themselves would have been housed by the church. I mean, Corinth would have kept their copy, obviously, and Philippi would have kept a copy. But they would have, Colossae, for example, would have probably made a copy of their copy and sent it to Laodicea. Colossians 4:16 says, be sure and have the letter that I wrote to Laodicea, which we don't have. Make sure you read their copy. Make sure they read your copy. There's some questions. Maybe Ephesus, the letter to the Ephesians, maybe it is the letter to the Laodiceans, because in Ephesus 1, where it says to the church at Ephesus, the phrase "at Ephesus" has very little support for it. It's really to the church, and tradition says that it was written to the church at Ephesus. But what if that was originally written to Laodicea and made its circular rounds and would have been fairly close to Ephesus, and then maybe after it got to the second or third location, hits Ephesus, and then the next people who get it after Ephesus said, we got this letter from Ephesus. Well, put Ephesus on there, make sure people know where we got it from. And maybe that's how the phrase "in Ephesus" got put there. Or maybe it was a marginal reading that someone put in there. That's the collection of the New Testament. You'll hear sometimes that it didn't happen until 393 A.D. That would be the Council of Hippo, where it was ultimately ratified by the church. But all the church was doing was recognizing the books that were already widely accepted. I believe the document is the Didache from about 120, but it might be the Diatessaron. One of those two documents from about 120 lists basically the books of our New Testament as the books that are accepted. So, yes, a seal of approval was put on it in 393, but most people already understood what it was in 120. That's pretty powerful to me. All right, verse 13, we got a minute. So now faith, hope, and love abide. It's interesting, you have this compound subject, faith, hope, and love, all three of them, which would make it a plural subject, but the verb is in the singular. I don't know why that is, but faith, hope, and love abide, or we might more literally say faith, hope, and love abides, but that's bad grammar. And here, it's kind of bad grammar. Faith, hope, and love abide. Now, some have suggested that, well, it's because he's talking about these three things, then maybe it's more pointing at that three that is like it's a triptych or a triad. In other words, it's not three individual things, but these three things as one remain. I kind of think that's the way Paul is talking about it. These three, but the greatest of these is love. And this word "greatest" is the same word that he used back in chapter 12 in verse 20 or 31. This, the higher or more excellent way. It's the same word that is used here. The greatest. The greatest of these is love. A lot of question about why is love the greatest. I think this has to do with the fact that love has always existed because God loves us. And our love is merely a reflection of the love that God already has. And when we look at the history of things, Romans chapter 8, is it? I've got it in my notes here. Romans chapter 8 and verse 24 says that our hope, what's going to happen to it when we get to the next realm? It's gone. We don't hope for that which we see, right? Hope is going to eventually be done away with, or it's going to not be needed. Faith again, faith works how? Through love. Galatians 5 and verse 6. We walk by faith now, but the anticipation is, then we'll walk by sight. Faith and hope eventually will run out, but it appears to me that love will continue to remain. So as long as this life is, faith, hope, and love will remain. When the next realm or era starts, the era of eternity, the only one that will be needed then is love. And there again, it will exist because God will still love us even then. I think that's what makes love the greatest, especially if we take the idea of they remain now or currently. And of course, the triad. I think faith, hope, and love is replacing knowledge, tongues, and prophecy, the triad from verse 8. It's replacing that. Those things are going to be done away with now. Faith, hope, and love will remain until, and then only love will be needed past that. Because faith and hope, they'll be lost in heavenly sight as we sing. All right, I appreciate your attention tonight. We'll pick up in chapter 14 next week. I apologize for our excursus on the collection of the Pauline canon. And yes, I did a paper on that last semester. So that was, well, it was in the summer semester. So that was, yeah, I appreciate you giving me tossing me the softball so I could, I don't know that I knocked that one out of the park, but at least talk about some study that I've done as well. If you would, bow with me for a word of prayer as we finish.